Welcome to Shadow Talk, a cybersecurity podcast powered by ReliaQuest, the leader in agentic AI security operations. I'm John Dilgen, Cyber Threat Intelligence Analyst here at ReliaQuest.
And I'm Tehman Tariq, Senior Manager of Gray Matter Operations. And today we'll be discussing initial access and how the impact behind phishing emails has weakened.
Year over year, phishing has been one of the top threats to organizations. From sheer volume alone, organizations see more phishing emails than any other threats.
And to that point, John, volume isn't everything. Impact matters much more. What we've seen is that phishing is no longer the top initial access method that we used to see in years past, especially for malware and ransomware delivery.
That's true. Social engineering via phone calls and web pages has really taken that top spot. And today we're going to break down this landscape shift.
Specifically, we're going to detail the key techniques threat actors are abusing, such as ShinyHunters vishing attacks and web page copy-paste abuse like ClickFix.
Now, for this episode, I really want our listeners to understand that vulnerabilities are an important piece of initial access. However, we have and will cover those in other episodes. So today, our focus is going to be initial access methods other than vulnerabilities. So let's kind of set the stage here. In our 2025 annual threat report, we saw that phishing was the most prominent initial access technique, making over 34% of the customer incidents we saw in 2024, while drive-by compromise was only 24%. And often we saw phishing lead to credential harvesting, business email compromise, and even ransomware deployment. And what's key here is that the volume hasn't really changed. Organizations are still seeing just as much phishing as ever, if not more. But the impact has less malware and ransomware delivery, and also data exfiltration from these phishing emails. And this is actually something we spoke about back in November in a previous Shadow Talk episode where we had our threat hunters sharing their insights and what trends they're seeing. And last year, we saw campaigns like Black Basta's use of Teams phishing really drive critical impact, like data exfiltration and ransomware.
And one of the key elements behind that campaign was the social engineering aspect.
That's exactly right, Tehman. And beyond vulnerability exploitation, social engineering is a top tactic driving critical impact from initial access. So there are three main social engineering tactics that we're seeing in use against ReliaQuest customers. Number one is going to be ShinyHunters vishing. And number two is going to be copy-paste abuse through tactics like ClickFix and fake CAPTCHA. And then finally, we have legitimate software impersonation by malware such as BowLoader and Oyster.
And let's actually detail these a lot more. The key aspect that I want everyone to think about is how these go beyond just technical, like specific methods that we've seen that go from like phishing, for example. Each one of these take that social engineering aspect to the next level, the way that they target users specifically. So we're going to start with ShinyHunters vishing to start. We had a quick mention of this campaign last week, and really to recap it for the audience, in late January 2026, we identified a campaign in which threat actors are conducting voice phishing and targeting users directly from their mobile phones while also impersonating like corporate IT or service desk personnel. The way that this is impactful, though, is by impersonating those IT members at Surface Desk. It feels like they've infiltrated it to like one step deeper within their company, and it adds that user trust that they're typically looking for. The other way that they execute this as attack is by convincing the user to navigate to a phishing site, which typically will impersonate some sort of SSO application for their organization. So you can almost see it as like a company name, and then you append SSO to the end of it, and then the user goes there. They see their organization name. They feel like they're going through a rudimentary process that they already have built in. And since that trust is now there and they're going through their own mechanisms, they're going to be more likely to enter their like password and apply their MFA to give that access to their specific account, which has been a crazy initial access point that we have seen. This activity also presents elevated risk because it bypasses many email controls and relies on real-time user manipulation. This greatly increases the likelihood of credential capture and subsequent access to enterprise software as a service environments. This aligns with what we've seen from ShinyHunters' end goal around capturing that type of data from those software as a service applications specifically.
Yeah, and I want to interrupt here just to really highlight something for our audience. you may have heard ShinyHunters. They have now evolved more into the name known as Scattered Lapsus Hunters, which is really the merger of Scattered Spider, Lapsus, and ShinyHunters. For simplicity, we're currently calling them ShinyHunters, but this is just important to know as we get into the conversation later in the episode.
Yep, absolutely. And now going into our next topic, we're going to talk about the copy paste abuse that we're seeing. This is also a social engineering method that displays a fake error message on a web page to trick a user into executing malicious code and then downloading malware. So we've commonly seen this type of tactic be driven within ClickFix, which is one where it displays a fake error message and then that user needs to fix this by executing a command. This can typically be done over PowerShell as one of the most common mechanisms we've seen this for during our research. Another method we've seen is fake CAPTCHA, where instead of an error message being prompted, a CAPTCHA is displayed, and then this needs to be solved by executing commands. So now this bypasses typical controls because it's getting the user to go ahead and run these commands on their behalf. So whereas a lot of different types of AV tools, endpoint tools are looking for those commands to run from a different type of application, we're seeing this be more successful because the end user is actually performing this directly.
That's exactly right. And to round things out, legitimate software impersonation by malware. So the top malware that ReliaQuest observed in 2025 were both Bowloader and Oyster. And they're both spreading by impersonating legitimate software, including things like Microsoft Teams, PDF converters, and common IT tools such as PuTTY and WinSCP. And this tactic works through search engine optimization poisoning, which drives the sites hosting malware to the top of browser search results. And because the impersonated software are commonly used, this tactic generates really large amounts of traffic from many organizations as these users go out on web pages searching for this software naturally. So let's kind of discuss this and break these down a little bit more. So Taman, I'm really curious, as we've mentioned, why did phishing fall off as like it has?
And I think it's a question that a lot of individuals have. And I'm going to give a little bit of my history here. Every time I've spoken with customers, it's always been around, hey, like our biggest attack vectors right now is phishing and ransomware. What can we do to solve this specifically? Right. And it went from individual phishing instances to solving campaigns to solving business email compromise. And now we're getting to the point where like the number one piece is AI driven phishing. So, how do we solve all of these pieces? For me, based off of our recent stories right now, the reason why some of those phishing attacks are not going to be as successful or won't be the most popular method, so to say, is because we've seen that advancement in email security tools. Email security tools are looking for a lot of those different pieces that I've mentioned, looking for that AI usage, looking for those campaign indicators that we know it's hitting most of their organization. So, really, that comes with an advancement of email security tools. And with that drive in those tools, we're seeing less and less of those successful phishing attacks. Not saying it's fully diminished, but we are seeing other mechanisms being used. So, more importantly, there is a decline in the drive by success of these new methods we're discussing. For example, I want to illustrate three of the ones that we just mentioned. For vishing specifically, we see faster account compromise than we saw with email credential capture. With copy paste abuse, we've seen dynamic configuration that helps deceive users, capture new objectives, and bypass security controls. In that final one with impersonation, malware delivered to a targeted user is going to be a lot easier, especially when they're looking at it from like an IT level, and when they're trying to masquerade as an IT tool, for example. So it adds that level of credibility that we weren't seeing before.
Yeah, I think those are some really important points. Like you mentioned earlier, the difference between a email credential, I should say credential capture through email phishing and vishing, it is just so much faster. We get direct access to that account. And it's what's something we've seen really in key campaigns, like by Scattered Spider, for example. And another thing to highlight is around that impersonation. If we're targeting tools commonly used by IT staff, that almost allows us to skip a step in privilege escalation where we now have much larger access to the network, much larger access to run commands. So it really just highlights and accelerates that campaign. So
Yep.
another question for you I want to dive into is how does the current ShinyHunters campaign relate to previous campaigns we've seen from groups like Black Basta and Scattered Spider?
Yep, absolutely. And I'm going to start by focusing on Black Basta specifically. So they impersonated help desk and IT staff through Microsoft Teams to phish users for computer access. Whereas with ShinyHunters campaign, we're currently seeing them impersonating help desk and IT staff through phone calls for account takeover. So by impersonating that help desk and that IT staff, they're taking that step that's going to be a lot quicker and they're getting directly to the end user that we weren't seeing previously.
Yeah, and really manipulating that user trust, like you mentioned.
Yep.
But I think this is important. It really opens up a large discussion around tactics overlapping between groups. And there's really two key points I want to highlight here. One of which is how threat actors pick up known tactics that are working in the environment. And the second one is how affiliates move groups and bring their tactics. So breaking these down, we know that threat actors grab tactics that work and known good tactics. So, for example, last year we released a report on the decline of Black Basta, and in that report we tracked their main phishing method, impersonating that IT through Teams messages. And even though the group had disbanded in February 2025, their tactics lived on well into April and past April. And this really highlights how the group names really don't matter as much, so much as the tactics and the TTPs that we're seeing. There's another element to this, which is the affiliates moving between groups. And it's important to understand that the initial access members of groups, specifically extortion and ransomware groups, are some of the lowest skilled and least paid members of the group, especially in groups like Black Basta. And so these people are always hungry for work. And if the group dies, they still need to pay the bills. They didn't collect millions like those above them. So they're going to move skills, or I should say, they're going to move groups. And when they do, they're going to bring those tactics with them. But taking things back to the question we asked earlier, so how did that ShinyHunters campaign compare to Scattered Spider?
Shadow Talk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, Gray Matter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at ReliaQuest.com.
Taking a look at Scattered Spider specifically, we saw them pretend to be users to phish IT and gain account access, ultimately with the goal of delivering ransomware. Previously, Scattered Spider has made multiple calls to reset passwords and then MFA, so the fatigue attacks typically tend to fail.
Yeah, and I think that's another important element here from what we've seen. So we mentioned that ShinyHunters has incorporated people from Scattered Spider, right? And so in previous campaigns, you may be familiar with Scattered Spider, especially around the Dragon Force ransomware attacks we saw last year. In those campaigns, we saw multiple calls. The first call trying to get access to that account, typically a CFO's account, and getting that password and that credentials. Once they got into that account, they would then try their typical MFA fatigue attacks. And if that failed, they would then only place a second call to the help desk to get access. I think it's really interesting here that in one call, they are getting password access and MFA access from these users. In fact, the whole premise that the threat actors are using to get these users on a call is the premise that they're going to reset that MFA device to help facilitate that in and of itself. The next thing I think is really interesting about the ShinyHunters campaign is the fact that the scripts that they used for data collection had data prioritization. So what do I mean is the scripts were looking for keywords to find that sensitive data, and the keywords they ran first were likely to bring back the most critical data first. The keywords were for things like proof of concepts, confidential, Salesforce, which we know ShinyHunters targets in high volume, as well as VPN access to secure those persistence methods through external accounts.
And those callouts on those keywords is actually great because the biggest thing that I want to highlight here is that threat actors not only want as much data as possible, but they also want the most valuable data as fast as possible. Now, moving on to our next question. John, what I have for you is what makes the copy paste abuse so notable right now?
Yeah, it's really notable for its evolution and its flexibility that threat actors have when they're deploying this tactic. So for some context, we've seen copy paste abuse for a long time. It really started back in 2024, gaining traction with tactics like clearfake. And I just want to highlight here that we've seen so many changes in evolution, specifically around things like execution structure, the social engineering method that they're using to get the end user to execute those commands, and even the objective that copy paste abuse is going for. Now I'm going to walk through a little bit of a timeline, if you will, of changes and patterns, and understand that there's a little bit of technical details here, but they matter less. And what I'm really trying to stress is the amount of changes that have been made. So in its original implementations, we saw copy-paste abuse executing through command line and PowerShell, where they're telling the user to input those commands. From there, they evolved into telling the user to implement them into the Windows Run prompt. And even further, they then told the user to implement them into File Explorer. Also, they tried to execute, so the exact executable on the system they used to run those commands was either through Windows MSHTA and then later evolved into curl. And all of these were in response to defenders catching on to those tactics, building detections and security controls in place, and now the defenders used a new tactic to change. Likewise, in social engineering, we saw the original ClickFix and ClearFake. They displayed a web page error that said something very simple, like your web browser is out of date and cannot access this site. Please execute this command. Very similar to what we saw with Sock Ghoulish back in the day. And more recently, it's evolved into that fake CAPTCHA, or pretending to be that very common CAPTCHA that's so common on authentication portals that a user sees on average every day, likely. Now, instead, you have to execute this command to verify that you're a human. And one of the most really important highlights of this that I do want to call out is a campaign we've touched on a few times, that North Korean threat known as Contagious Interview had a instance of ClickFix that was delivered through phishing emails. And understand, Contagious Interview is under the premise of users getting hired. So the link itself was designed to look like an interview video portal. And the error message that was displayed had the user configure their microphone and their headphones in order to fix the error. And the reason I really bring that up is because if you think of the original ones, where it's a seemingly generic web page error, your browser needs to update, that's pretty easy for a user to notice. But a interview asking you to configure the microphone, that's really commonplace for every interview software. A lot harder to notice. Again, just showcasing that flexibility. And then finally, the changes in objectives. Most implementations we've seen around copy-paste abuse have to deal with the user downloading malware by executing those commands. More recently, we've seen a variant known as consent fix, which is now asking the users to implement their single sign-on URLs directly into the phishing web page, allowing the threat actor to capture that session, eventually leading to account takeover. And again, I just want to stress here, this is a really dynamic tactic that's had a lot of use and flexibility by threat actors, something we will likely see moving forward in 2026. So we've outlined these threats pretty well, but Tehman, what do organizations need to do to defend against them?
Absolutely. And John and I have created a few different recommendations that we want the audience to hear. The first one specifically is to create or verify your standard operating procedures. The first one is software downloads. Understanding what type of software is allowed within your environment is an easy ask, but one that many organizations fail with, and that's one where we've seen be a huge initial vector. The other one is IT communications. Make sure end users understand how they can reach out to IT team for any sort of issues, whether that be hardware issues or software issues, and understand that line of communication that is there. The other one comes with browser issues as well. This aligns with what type of software is allowed within the environment and how they should be properly utilizing that type of software. The other recommendation I have is education around end users specifically. As we mentioned with the copy paste abuse, for end users being aware of these different types of threats and understanding how CAPTCHAs typically handle, how impersonation usually happens, what types of credentials that they can provide over a phone, and usually it's just about nothing unless it's with a verified source. We want to make sure end users understand these new types of attack methods that are being utilized, because these are the ones that have been most successful against end users specifically. The other piece I know I mentioned is like IT impersonation and just phishing as a whole. We've seen it go beyond the typical phishing tactics and it go much more into phone calls. And that phone call tends to be a lot easier for users to want to feel a little bit more safe, especially if they don't know who's on the other end. They're believing it is an IT personnel. They are believing it's someone that's there to solve their issue. So they're going to be a little bit more open about what they're willing to share. And then the final one is how to download approved software, making sure that there is a process for how, if a new software was to be introduced into the environment, that has an approval process associated with it to make sure you're not introducing something unwanted into your environment. Any other recommendations to add there, John?
Yeah, I have one, but before I do, I really want to double down on that educate end users. I know it sounds a little generic sometimes, and we often say it, but this is a hill I will gladly die on because I can tell you from experience working with our customers, what I have seen work so effectively, specifically against the Black Basta tactics and the scattered spider tactics, is when that targeted end user training is implemented, it really does stop most of the attacks before they even get initial access. So circling back, the last control that I have is going to be to harden network controls, disable things like user browser, or I should say user PowerShell execution for those non-IT users. This really cuts out a lot of the copy paste abuse potential. And then finally, application control software. So not only are we implementing the education and the SOPs around where to get that software, but also we are hardening our environment against users just going out and pulling any file they want to, and also listing approved software and versions that users can grab from our portals that we would like to. So those are the overall defense recommendations. But Tehman, what do organizations need to do tomorrow to get ahead of these threats?
Absolutely. The immediate action plan for CISOs and their executive team is to understand where your critical data exists within your network, what defenses are placed around it, and its risks if exposed.
Yeah, and my recommendation is going to be for defenders, but it's very well in line with what you have, and that's going to be to harden that critical data storage, slow down the attacker with automated containment around it, and layered defenses. You know, a very wise cybersecurity person here at ReliaQuest once told me that layered defenses is kind of like layering a bunch of pieces of Swiss cheese. You're never going to have complete coverage on anything. 0 days always exist. So ideally, we want to layer Swiss cheese around those holes and those gaps, ultimately slowing down the attackers. So as we highlighted earlier, they're going to look for that critical data the fastest. If we can slow them down and hopefully contain them before they get there, we got our best chance for defending. Well, that's all for this week. Thanks for listening to another episode of Shadow Talk. If you'd like to get in touch, we're just an email away. You can send your questions to shadowtalk@reliaquest.com. Please don't forget to subscribe so you can get next week's episode delivered to your platform of choice. And we really appreciate it if you can rate and review Shadow Talk wherever you listen. It will make a huge difference and help us reach new listeners. We'll be back next week with another episode of Shadow Talk. See you then.